welcome to today's Explainer. I'm so glad you're joining us, because today we're diving into something that's honestly a bit of a game changer. We're going to unpack a piece of writing that can completely shift how we look at our life's purpose and our own inner potential. We're moving way past the standard surface-level advice you see plastered everywhere and uncovering a much deeper spiritual framework for understanding who we actually are. So, let me ask you something to just kind of chew on for a second. Do you truly know yourself? Or if we're being completely honest here, do you just know your traits? It's so common these days to think we've got this self-knowledge thing figured out just because we know our emotions, our quirks, or what triggers us. But the material we're looking at today completely flips that on its head. It challenges us to ask if we possess a much deeper, more spiritually grounded understanding of ourselves. Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. Beyond basic self-knowledge. Right out of the gate, we've got to establish a really clear distinction. Think about the phrase, getting to know yourself. When you hear that, what pops into your head? Probably some pretty mainstream concepts, right? Things like boosting self-esteem, mapping out core values, analyzing your emotions, or writing out a list of your strengths and weaknesses. But our source text, which is titled Knowing Thyself, aims so much higher. Knowing thyself actually speaks to something profound within you. The goal isn't just psychological comfort. The goal is to draw the maximum spiritual benefit from this entire concept. Section 2. The common perspective. Now, to get us to that deeper spiritual benefit, the author proposes a framework built around a saying I guarantee you've heard before: to whom much is given, much is expected. We all know this phrase, right? Generally, we use it to express that we expect a certain level of action or a certain quality of behavior from somebody. Basically, if we think someone's been granted a special position, a big responsibility, or a really unique talent, well, we expect them to step up to the plate. But take a step back and notice how this common perspective actually trains our brains to operate. For most of us, when we hear to whom much is given, much is expected, our attention instantly zooms in on the gifts. We start by looking at what we've been given, the talents we hold, and then we naturally reflect on how we're using those specific gifts. Basically, we start with an inventory of our talents. And, here is the really subtle limitation of that common approach. If we hit our roadblock and immediately look only to our existing gifts to fix it, we might just try to force those gifts into some newly brainstormed solution. But as the text points out, that resulting solution might still completely lack the actual spiritual insight required for the problem we're trying to resolve. We essentially end up just throwing our familiar talents at the wall, hoping something sticks, without ever really understanding the deeper spiritual expectation at play. Section 3. Flipping the script. Now, what's really interesting about this side is, well, this is the central aha moment of our entire explainer. Instead of our standard saying, to whom much is given, much is expected, the author asks us to flip it entirely. From whom much is expected, much has been given. It's literally the exact same words, just reversed. And as you'll see, these two perspectives affect us completely differently, and they lead our self-analysis in two entirely different directions. Let's actually just sit with this flipped version for a second. From whom much is expected, much has been given. It definitely feels heavier, doesn't it? It requires a much, much deeper level of introspection. Instead of starting with a checklist of what you own, you're starting with a really profound acknowledgement of what is required of you. This flipped restatement shifts our immediate focus entirely onto meeting expectations. It tells us that our life is inherently bound to fulfilling responsibilities. And crucially, taking on this attitude immediately creates this deep sense of humility and a commitment to fulfilling your duty as your very first step. You aren't puffing your chest out about your gifts anymore. You're humbling yourself before your responsibilities. Let's move to the next part and see how this builds, because it creates a really fascinating chain reaction. Step 1, you focus on the expectations placed upon you. Step 2, this leads to a humble acceptance that, hey, maybe you could be wrong, which paves the way for input from other sources. Step 3, this newfound openness allows a much greater possibility for the voice of the spirit to actually penetrate your search for a solution. And finally, step 4, that spiritual guidance directs you on how best to recognize and call upon the gifts you've actually been endowed with. The text makes a really beautiful point here. We are human, and our challenges aren't just annoying obstacles. They're actually meant to help us learn to use our spiritual sensing. The author calls this intuition. We use this intuition to recognize our gifts so we can fulfill our responsibilities. It helps us see that gifts are given precisely to help us cope with challenges. And wild as it sounds, that was actually envisioned when we were endowed with the gift in the very first place. So this crucial takeaway is perfectly summarized when we stack the common approach right up against the spiritually desired response. The common approach? It starts with your gifts, maybe prompts you to think of other gifts you have, but it often lacks real spiritual insight. The spiritually desired response, on the other hand, starts with the shortcoming, the much that is expected. It judges the situation strictly on a spiritual basis, using golden rules and the laws of creation as the absolute only yardstick. And it's only after doing that that we look to our gifts to develop corrective measures. Section 4, the spiritual synthesis. And this brilliantly illustrates our next point. With all this talk of flipping the script, you might be thinking we just need to toss the original saying right out the window. But the text is super clear. We are absolutely not ditching it. The new framework just adds another necessary perspective. It's exactly like the classic glass of water metaphor. Is it half empty or is it half full? Well, the truth is, both perspectives help us examine a challenge. You genuinely need both to arrive at the most level-headed, balanced way to address any situation. As the author wraps up, approaching this common saying from the two perspectives discussed should help us see how it applies from both sides. By balancing our awareness of our gifts with a really humble acknowledgement of our spiritual expectations, we learn to look so much more comprehensively within ourselves. We end up guided by the Spirit, and we find the absolute optimum solution using the exact resources we've been endowed with. Which brings us to a final, pretty vital question to reflect on. In your own life, are you just counting your gifts, or are you actually stepping up to your expectations? What better way to gradually and assuredly get to truly know ourselves than by balancing our responsibilities with our gifts? Take this flipped perspective with you today. Lean into that intuition and use it to fulfill your true purpose for being here. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep seeking that deeper understanding.